At 6:30 on June 6, 1944, Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. crouched inside landing craft tank 592 as it pitched violently through the surf toward Omaha Beach. German 88mm shells were already walking across the water around them, towering columns of spray erupting closer with each impact. Woodson was 21 years old, a newly trained medic with just 4 months of medical instruction behind him. This was his first combat mission. He carried medical supplies for the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only African-American combat unit assigned to land during the D-Day assault. The battalion had trained for 8 months to deploy massive hydrogen-filled barrage balloons over the invasion beaches. Their purpose was simple and deadly serious: prevent German aircraft from diving low to strafe American troops during the landings. Woodson was one of 5 medics assigned to land with Battery A in the first wave. The remaining 416 men of the battalion would follow later, hauling balloons, winches, steel cables, and hydrogen cylinders ashore once the beach was secured. According to intelligence briefings, German resistance on Omaha would be light. The briefings were catastrophically wrong. At 6:45, German artillery found LCT 592. The first shell slammed into the port bow, detonating with a concussion that tore steel apart like paper. 3 Navy crewmen were killed instantly. Shrapnel scythed through the compartment, shredding flesh and bone. Seconds later, a second shell struck amidships, killing 5 more sailors. Blood pooled on the deck, mixing with seawater as the craft lurched violently. A third explosion tore through the stern. Shrapnel ripped into Woodson's left thigh and buttocks, burying hot metal fragments deep in muscle. His trousers darkened instantly with blood. The pain was blinding, but he remained conscious. The craft began to list to starboard. Water rushed in through twisted hull plates. Of the 26 Navy personnel operating LCT 592, 25 were dead or dying. Only the coxswain remained alive, desperately fighting the controls as the vessel settled lower in the water. German machine gun fire raked the deck. Bullets punched through supply crates and medical chests, splintering wood and scattering bandages and morphine syringes across the floor. Woodson pressed field dressings against his own wounds, slowing the bleeding as best he could. There was no time for proper treatment. Men around him screamed, some missing limbs, others clutching abdominal wounds where intestines spilled through torn uniforms. At 6:52, LCT 592 struck a German teller mine buried beneath the sandbar 100 yards offshore. The explosion ripped open the bottom of the craft. Steel plates buckled inward. The vessel collapsed into 8 feet of water, dumping men and equipment into the surf. Machine gun fire continued from concrete pillboxes high on the bluffs. Woodson jumped. The weight of his soaked uniform and medical bag dragged him under. Shrapnel wounds burned in his legs as he kicked for the surface. Each movement sent agony through his thigh, but he forced himself upward, gasping as he broke the waterline. The surf was filled with bodies. Some men thrashed helplessly, unable to swim under the weight of their gear. Others floated face down, already dead. Ahead, Omaha Beach was a slaughterhouse. Interlocking German machine gun fire swept the sand in precise arcs. Mortars crashed down among the assault waves. Artillery from inland batteries exploded with terrifying accuracy. Smoke from burning vehicles blended with morning fog, reducing visibility to chaos. Woodson waded forward. Every step required deliberate effort. His left leg threatened to give way. Blood streamed down into his boot. He clenched his jaw and kept moving. Men were dying everywhere. He was a medic. That mattered more than the pain. At 7 o'clock, he reached the beach and collapsed behind a steel beach obstacle. Machine gun rounds snapped through the air 6 inches above his head. He took a breath and assessed the scene. Wounded soldiers lay scattered across 200 yards of open sand between the waterline and the seawall. Some cried out for medics. Others lay silent, unmoving. No aid stations existed. No organized evacuation had begun. The assault was faltering. And the mission of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, to protect the beach from air attack, had not even begun. The Luftwaffe never came. German artillery and machine guns were doing the killing. Barrage balloons were useless here. Medics were not. Woodson pulled himself upright behind the steel obstacle and opened his medical bag. Inside, miraculously intact despite explosions and seawater, were morphine syrettes, sulfa powder packets, pressure bandages, tourniquets, plasma bottles, scissors. He didn't hesitate. He crawled toward the nearest wounded man. The first casualty was a private from the 1st Infantry Division. A bullet had punched clean through his right shoulder, entry and exit wounds bleeding heavily. Woodson cut away the uniform with scissors, dusted both wounds with sulfa powder, wrapped them tightly, injected morphine, and tagged the man's jacket with time and dosage. 3 minutes. German machine gun fire snapped overhead, forcing Woodson flat into the sand. He waited, counted seconds, then crawled again when the firing paused. The next soldier had lost his right foot to artillery shrapnel. Bone protruded from the torn flesh. Arterial blood pumped rhythmically from the stump. Woodson slid a tourniquet high above the knee and twisted until the bleeding stopped. Morphine. Plasma line started. The man would survive if evacuation came. It hadn't yet. By 7:30, Woodson had treated 12 wounded men. His own leg burned. Blood soaked his trousers and boot. He ignored it. The beach had become an inferno. Landing craft burned in the surf. Disabled tanks sat helplessly on open sand. Bodies lay everywhere, some motionless, others writhing. The air reeked of cordite, blood, seawater, and smoke. Officers shouted orders that went nowhere. German fire pinned everything down. 20 yards from the waterline, Woodson spotted a shell crater 4 feet deep. It offered partial protection from direct fire. He dragged wounded men into it, one at a time, using their webbing straps, their collars, whatever he could grip. The crater became his aid station. Other soldiers noticed. Soon they were bringing casualties to him. At 8 o'clock, Woodson heard shouting from the surf. 3 soldiers had been swept from a landing craft when its anchor cable snapped. The current was dragging them past the beach obstacles into deeper water. All 3 were fully loaded. Helmets, rifles, ammunition, packs. The weight was pulling them under. The nearest was 20 yards offshore. The farthest, 35 yards. Machine gun fire stitched the waterline. Anyone entering the surf would be exposed for at least 2 full minutes, with no cover. Woodson looked down at his medical bag. If he went into the water, the bag would be lost. If he drowned, there would be no medic left in this sector of Omaha Beach. 12 wounded men lay in his crater. More were arriving every minute. The 3 soldiers were screaming, going under, resurfacing, going under again. 30 seconds more, and they would be dead. Woodson stood up. Pain exploded through his left leg. Blood streamed from thigh to boot. German bullets snapped past him, striking sand and steel. He ran. At 8:02, Woodson entered the surf. Water surged against his legs, each step sending agony through the shrapnel wounds. Waist deep, chest deep. The first drowning soldier was already sinking. Woodson pushed forward anyway. Woodson's boots lost contact with the sand. He was swimming now. German machine gun fire raked the water around him. Bullets punched the surface, throwing up sharp, white splashes inches from his head. He kept his face low and swam harder. The first soldier went under. Woodson dove into the murky water, reached blindly, felt fabric, then webbing. He grabbed the man's harness and hauled upward. They broke the surface together. The soldier was unconscious, not breathing. Woodson maneuvered behind him, hooked his left arm across the man's chest, and began swimming for shore, pulling with his right arm and kicking with his right leg. The current ran parallel to the beach, dragging them sideways. Woodson angled against it, inch by inch. A mortar shell detonated 30 yards away. The concussion slammed through the water, rattling his skull, ringing his ears. He kept moving. His wounded left leg dragged uselessly behind him. After 3 minutes, his boots scraped sand. He stood, staggered forward, dragged the soldier from the surf, rolled him face down, and pressed on his back. Water poured from the man's lungs. He coughed, gasped, and began breathing. Once saved, Woodson turned back toward the water. The second soldier was farther out, 25 yards offshore, still fighting the current, still going under and coming back up. Woodson waded in again. His shrapnel wounds had reopened. Blood streamed down his leg. Salt water burned into the torn muscle. He ignored it. When he reached the man, panic took over. The soldier clawed at Woodson, wrapped his arms around him, dragged him under. They sank together. Woodson broke free underwater, surfaced behind the man, locked him into a cross-chest carry, and began swimming shoreward. The soldier fought him, flailing wildly. Artillery opened up again. Shells landed closer now, 50 yards left, 40 yards right. The Germans were walking fire across the surf. The soldier suddenly went limp. Woodson reached the beach, dragged the body onto the sand, checked for breathing, nothing. He began artificial respiration, pressing rhythmically, releasing, pressing again. After a minute, the soldier coughed violently, vomited seawater, and drew a ragged breath. Two saved. The third soldier was nearly lost. 40 yards offshore, drifting farther out, barely visible through smoke and spray. Then the head disappeared and did not come back up. Woodson entered the water again. His left leg collapsed beneath him. He fell forward into the surf and began swimming using only his arms, dragging the injured leg behind. Pain radiated through his thigh and hip with every stroke. 5 minutes passed. He reached the area where the soldier had gone under, dove, searched blindly, found nothing. Surfaced, spun, spotted a helmet floating 10 yards away. He swam to it, dove again, felt webbing, grabbed, pulled. The third soldier surfaced, blue-faced, lifeless. Woodson locked him into position and turned toward shore. The current was stronger this far out. Progress was agonizingly slow. His right leg cramped. His arms burned. The beach looked impossibly distant. After 10 minutes, his right boot scraped sand. He stood, dragged the body onto the beach, and began artificial respiration. 2 minutes passed. 3. No response. Woodson cleared the airway, sealed his mouth over the soldiers, and began mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Breath in. Chest rose. Released. Again. Again. After 2 minutes, the soldier coughed. Water poured from his mouth. He gasped. He began breathing. 3 men pulled from the sea. 3 lives saved. Woodson crawled back toward his aid station. He could no longer walk. His left leg was swollen to twice its normal size, stiff and burning. Infection was already spreading beneath the skin. He dragged himself across the sand using only his arms, pulling his body forward inch by inch until he reached the shell crater. 12 wounded men were waiting. At 0900, Woodson went back to work. His medical supplies were nearly gone. Morphine was scarce. Bandages were running out. He rationed everything with ruthless efficiency. 1 morphine cigarette per casualty instead of 2, smaller dressings where possible, no waste. A soldier was brought to him with his left hand nearly torn off. The wrist was shattered. Bone fragments protruded through torn flesh. Arteries were severed. The hand hung by strips of tendon and skin, mangled beyond saving. Woodson examined the wound. He had never amputated a limb. He had learned the procedure in training, on chalkboards, in manuals, on mannequins, but never on a living man. He had no surgical instruments beyond scissors and a knife. No anesthetic except morphine. He gave the soldier 2 morphine cigarettes, 1 in each thigh. Waited 5 minutes. The morphine dulled the pain, but the soldier remained conscious. Woodson worked fast. He cut through the remaining tendons. The soldier screamed. Woodson cut through muscle, then skin. The hand came free. He dropped it into the sand. Blood surged from the wrist stump. Woodson pressed down hard, found the severed arteries, tied them off with suture material from his bag. He packed the wound with sulfa powder, wrapped it tight with pressure bandages, using the last of what he had. The amputation took 15 minutes. The soldier survived and went into shock. Woodson elevated his legs and covered him with a blanket taken from a dead man nearby. By 1000, Woodson had treated 63 wounded men since landing. His medical bag was empty. He borrowed supplies from medics arriving later. Staff Sergeant Alfred Bell brought morphine and plasma. Corporal Eugene Worthy brought bandages and sulfa powder. Together, they kept the aid station functioning. The invasion was moving inland, but the beach remained a graveyard. Bodies covered the sand. Wounded men lay everywhere. Aid stations overflowed. German artillery continued to fall. Mortars landed without warning. Machine gun fire faded as pillboxes were destroyed, but snipers remained active on the bluffs. Medics were prime targets. Red Cross armbands made them easy to see. Several medics were shot while treating casualties. At 1100, American destroyers moved in close. USS Frankfurt, USS Doyle, USS McCook closed to within 800 yards of shore. Their 5-inch guns hammered German positions on the bluffs. The ground shook. Pillboxes collapsed. Artillery fire slackened. Infantry began advancing faster. Woodson kept working. He cleaned wounds, set broken bones, tightened tourniquets, administered morphine. His movements were mechanical now, driven by training and instinct. Pain, fear, exhaustion, none of it registered anymore. At 1300, a soldier was brought in gasping for air. A bullet had entered below the left shoulder blade and exited through the chest. Each breath sucked air into the wound. The lung was collapsing. Woodson acted instantly. He tore open morphine cigarette packaging and used the waxed paper to seal the entry wound, taping it on 3 sides to create a one-way valve. Air escaped but could not re-enter. He sealed the exit wound the same way and administered morphine. The soldier's breathing stabilized. At 1500, Staff Sergeant Bell examined Woodson's leg. Red streaks ran up his thigh toward his groin. The infection was spreading through the lymphatic system. Bell cleaned the wounds with iodine, applied fresh bandages, gave Woodson sulfa tablets, and ordered him to rest. Woodson refused. More casualties were coming. The aid station could not function without him. Bell did not argue. There were too few medics on Omaha Beach. Everyone who could still move was essential. By 1800 on June 6th, Woodson had been working 11 continuous hours, wounded, infected, exhausted, and still treating the wounded. He had treated 107 wounded soldiers. His fever was climbing. His vision blurred at the edges. His balance was gone. His left leg was completely useless now, swollen, rigid, burning beneath the skin. He no longer tried to walk. He crawled. He pulled himself between casualties using his arms, dragging his body through sand darkened by blood. And still the wounded kept coming. The sun set over Omaha Beach. Night fell at 2100 on June 6, 1944. The temperature dropped to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Woodson wore only his soaked uniform. No jacket, no blanket. His clothes were stiff with dried blood. He shivered violently between treating casualties, the fever amplifying the cold. Waves of chills alternated with burning sweats. German artillery continued after dark. The enemy could not see targets anymore. They fired by memory, by map, by instinct. Shells landed randomly among wreckage and bodies. Some fell into the water. Others detonated on the sand. A few struck clusters of troops and equipment. Woodson worked in blackout conditions. He used a small flashlight covered with red cellophane to examine wounds. The red glow was harder to spot from the bluffs, but it was still dangerous. He needed light. Without it, men would bleed out in darkness. At 2200, a soldier was brought to him screaming. Both legs were crushed. A tank had reversed over him in the dark. The driver never saw the wounded man lying in the sand. The steel treads had passed directly over both femurs. The soldier was conscious, fully aware. In agony, Woodson gave him 3 morphine cigarettes, more than regulation. The pain demanded it. He waited 10 minutes. The screaming faded to hoarse moans. The soldier's eyes went glassy, barely focused. Woodson examined the damage. Both femurs were shattered. Bone fragments floated beneath the skin. The right leg was bent at an impossible angle. The left was a compound fracture, white bone protruding through torn flesh. He needed splints. He had none. Woodson improvised. He broke rifle stocks, laid them along the legs, padded them with torn uniform fabric, tied them tight enough to immobilize the fractures, but loose enough to preserve circulation. He worked slowly, carefully, knowing one wrong movement could sever an artery. The splinting took 30 minutes. The soldier passed out before it was finished. Better unconscious than screaming. Woodson moved to the next casualty. At 2300, Staff Sergeant Bell returned with coffee taken from a supply dump inland. The coffee was weak, brewed from reused grounds, barely brown, but it was hot. Woodson drank an entire canteen cup. It was the first liquid he had consumed in 16 hours, aside from water borrowed from other soldiers' canteens. The caffeine sharpened his mind slightly. His vision cleared. His hand steadied. His leg worsened. The infection had spread above the knee. His entire thigh was swollen, discolored, hot to the touch. Red streaks climbed toward his hip, lymphatic infection, moving fast. Bell examined the leg again. He told Woodson he needed evacuation. A hospital ship. Intravenous antibiotics. Surgical debridement. Woodson refused. The aid station was still full. Evacuation would take hours. Those hours would leave wounded men untreated. Hull did not argue. At midnight, June 7th, Woodson had been working 17 continuous hours. He had treated 128 wounded soldiers. He kept count. Using a grease pencil on the back of a ration box, he recorded each casualty, name when possible, description when not, injury type, treatment given, time administered. The list was precise, organized. It helped him track morphine dosages, helped him remember who needed follow-up, helped him stay conscious through fever and exhaustion. Casualties continued arriving through the night. Landing craft still came in. Some hit mines. Others took artillery fire. Each explosion created more wounded. Men were carried or dragged to aid stations. Woodson's crater was now one of only 3 functioning aid stations on this section of Omaha Beach. At 0100 on June 7th, a badly burned soldier was brought to him. A German shell had struck an ammunition dump. The explosion ignited stored gasoline. The soldier had been standing beside it. His skin was blackened and blistered. Clothing melted into flesh. Burns covered his arms, chest, and face. He was barely conscious, breathing shallowly, the smell of burned fabric and flesh heavy in the air. Woodson knelt beside him and went back to work. Flash burns covered the soldier's face, neck, hands, and arms. The skin was blistered. In places it had peeled away completely. In others it was charred black, cracked, lifeless. He was conscious and screaming. Burn pain was different from gunshot wounds, different from broken bones. It was constant, overwhelming, impossible to escape. The nerves were destroyed unevenly, some dead, some exposed, creating agony that never paused. Woodson had almost nothing left for burns. He carried small tubes of burn ointment, meant for minor injuries. They were nowhere near enough for this. He applied what he had to the worst areas, the face and hands, using his fingers to spread the ointment gently, carefully. He wrapped the arms loosely in gauze to avoid constriction. He administered morphine, 2 cigarettes. The soldier needed more. Woodson could not give it. Morphine supplies were critically low now. Every dose had to be weighed against the next casualty still breathing. At 0200, German artillery began a sustained barrage. This was heavier than the sporadic night fire before. Shells landed in clusters. The Germans were trying to disrupt the American buildup, prevent units from organizing for the push inland. Woodson and the wounded pressed themselves flat in the crater. A shell landed 15 yards away. The blast slammed sand and shrapnel into the depression. Dirt rained down. The concussion shook the ground beneath them. Woodson's ears rang violently. The barrage lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, Woodson counted again. 3 men in his crater were dead, killed by shrapnel. 5 more were wounded. Men he had already treated now bled again, screamed again, needed help again. He went back to work. He layered fresh bandages over old ones. Reapplied pressure. Administered morphine where any remained. His movements were slower now, but still precise. At 0300, his vision began to fail. The fever was affecting his eyesight. Shapes blurred. Distances were unreliable. He relied on touch instead. Fingers found broken bones. Fingers felt arterial bleeding. Fingers detected heat and swelling that meant infection. His hands still worked. Training carried him forward when sight could not. At 0400, a soldier arrived with a bayonet wound through the abdomen. The German had driven the blade 4 inches deep before being killed. The American soldier had walked back to the beach holding his intestines inside the wound with both hands. Woodson examined him. The abdominal wall was punctured. Intestines were visible. Some were cut. The soldier was in shock. Pale skin, rapid breathing, weak pulse. Woodson could not fix what was inside. He pushed the intestines back into the cavity, dusted the wound with sulfa powder, applied a wide-pressure bandage, administered morphine. Stabilization was all he could offer. Surgery was required. A hospital ship was required. Evacuation was still slow. Landing craft were prioritized for supplies and reinforcements. Wounded followed later, if there was space. At 0500, first light appeared over the English Channel. Woodson had been working 22 hours without sleep. His count stood at 147 wounded soldiers treated. His medical supplies were gone. He borrowed from others when possible. His left leg was twice its normal size. His fever exceeded 103 degrees. His vision swam. His balance failed. Staff Sergeant Bell returned to the crater carrying supplies and news. A German counterattack was forming 2 miles inland. American units were requesting every available medic forward. Casualties would increase. Aid stations would be overwhelmed. Bell looked at Woodson, at the infected leg, at the fever-dulled eyes, at the blood-soaked uniform. He asked if Woodson could move. Woodson looked at the wounded men still waiting in the crater, looked at the supplies in Bell's hands, looked at the beach behind them where landing craft continued to arrive under fire. He nodded once. Staff Sergeant Bell handed Woodson fresh bandages and morphine curettes, then pointed inland toward the sound of renewed fighting. At 5:30 on June 7th, Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. left his crater aid station on Omaha Beach. He crawled the first 20 yards. His left leg would not support his weight. Bell helped him up and placed a rifle in his hands. Woodson used it as a crutch, leaning his full weight against the stock. Slowly, deliberately, he began moving inland. Behind him, Omaha Beach was unrecognizable. The sand was covered with wounded and dead. Destroyed landing craft burned in the surf. Tanks sat motionless where mines had blown off their tracks. Equipment lay scattered everywhere. Helmets, packs, rifles, torn medical kits. Smoke drifted across the beach in thick layers. The smell of cordite, blood, and diesel fuel clung to the air. Woodson moved step by step. Each movement sent pain through his infected leg. The rifle helped, but walking was still a struggle. Bell stayed close in case Woodson collapsed. Other medics from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion moved inland in small groups. Private First Class Warren Capers, Corporal Eugene Worthy, each carrying supplies, each heading toward the fighting 2 miles ahead. The path inland passed through a gap in the seawall blown open by engineers. Beyond the wall stretched 300 yards of exposed ground, then hedgerows. The hedges were ancient earthen embankments, 4 to 6 feet high, covered in thick vegetation. They divided the countryside into small fields and provided perfect defensive positions. German forces had fallen back into them after losing the beach. Machine guns, mortar teams, snipers, every hedgerow was a potential ambush. American troops advanced slowly, clearing one hedge line at a time. Woodson reached the first hedgerow at 6 o'clock. 3 wounded soldiers were crouched behind the earthen wall. One had a bullet through the calf. Another had shrapnel embedded in his shoulder. The third had taken a rifle round through the hand. Woodson treated them in sequence. Bandages, morphine, tags for evacuation. 15 minutes. By the time he finished, more wounded arrived. For men from a squad that had assaulted a German machine gun position. 2 were already dead. 2 were wounded and bleeding heavily. At 6:30, American artillery opened up from the beach. 105mm howitzers. The shells passed overhead with a sound like freight trains and detonated deep inland. The artillery softened German positions ahead of the advancing infantry. Woodson moved with the line. He stayed about 50 yards behind the assault troops, close enough to reach wounded quickly, far enough back to avoid direct fire. Other medics followed the same spacing. Doctrine, learned in training, now applied under fire. At 7 o'clock, Woodson reached a farmhouse that had been converted into a casualty collection point. The building had been cleared an hour earlier. Wounded men lay across the ground floor. A Navy corpsman worked among them. Lieutenant James Harris of the 1st Infantry Division coordinated evacuations. Harris saw Woodson immediately. He saw the swollen leg, the fever-glazed eyes, the blood-soaked uniform. He ordered Woodson to stop and receive treatment. Woodson refused. He had supplies. Wounded men needed care. He would continue. Harris did not argue. He needed every medic he could get. Intelligence reports warned that German forces were massing inland. A counterattack was forming. If it broke through, the Germans could reach the beach and disrupt the invasion. At 7:30, Woodson left the farmhouse. He leaned on his rifle and moved forward again. The sound of fighting grew louder. Machine gun fire cracked in long bursts. Rifles snapped in sharp, uneven rhythm. Explosions rolled across the fields ahead. The battle was less than half a mile away. Woodson increased his pace. He leaned harder on the rifle crutch, forced his injured leg forward, ignored the pain. Every step sent heat through the infected wound, but stopping was not an option. At 8 o'clock, he reached a squad pinned down behind a hedgerow. The men were spread along the earthen wall, pressed flat against the dirt. A German machine gun fired from a position 200 yards ahead. Each time an American soldier lifted his head, the gun answered instantly. The squad could not advance. They could not retreat. Several men were wounded. Woodson crawled to the nearest casualty. A bullet had passed through the upper arm, shattering the humerus. Bone fragments protruded from the wound. Blood soaked the sleeve. Woodson worked quickly. He splinted the arm using broken branches torn from the hedge, wrapped them tight with bandages, administered morphine, tagged the soldier for evacuation. German mortars began falling near the hedgerow. Shells burst in the open field behind them. Shrapnel hissed through the air. Dirt and leaves rained down. Woodson pressed himself flat against the ground as explosions shook the earth. At 8:30, American armor arrived. Two M4 Shermans rolled along the hedgerow, turrets swinging toward the German position. Their 75mm guns fired high-explosive rounds. The hedgerow ahead erupted in smoke and debris. The machine gun fell silent. The squad advanced. Woodson moved with them. At 9 o'clock, he reached a crossroads where multiple hedgerows met. American troops were consolidating the position. Soldiers dug foxholes, placed machine guns, prepared defenses against the counterattack everyone expected. Wounded men lay gathered near the intersection, waiting for treatment. Woodson went to work. A sucking chest wound. A compound fracture of the tibia. Multiple shrapnel wounds across back and legs. He sealed chest wounds, splinted fractures, cleaned and bandaged shrapnel injuries. His movements were automatic now, driven by training and repetition. At 9:30, German artillery found the crossroads. 88mm shells began landing in tight clusters. Accurate, relentless. The Germans knew Americans were massing there. Woodson and the wounded dove into a drainage ditch beside the road. The ditch was 3 feet deep and filled with muddy water. They lay submerged while shells exploded around them. One detonated 10 feet away. The blast wave rolled over the ditch, slamming bodies into the mud. Dirt and debris fell like rain. The barrage lasted 10 minutes. When it lifted, Woodson climbed out. 3 of the wounded had been hit again. New shrapnel wounds layered over old injuries. Woodson treated them immediately, using his last morphine and bandages. By 10 o'clock, his medical bag was empty. He turned back toward the beach. The walk took 30 minutes. His infected leg barely held him upright. Each step required concentration. The rifle crutch bore most of his weight. He reached a supply dump near the seawall. Wooden crates were stacked high. Bandages, morphine, sulfa powder, plasma. Woodson refilled his medical bag, stuffed extra supplies into his pockets, his helmet, anywhere he could carry them. At 10:45, a Navy corpsman examined his leg. The infection had spread to his hip. Red streaks climbed his side. The corpsman said Woodson needed immediate evacuation, surgery, antibiotics not available on the beach. Woodson refused. He had supplies. Wounded men were waiting. He turned and began limping back inland. The corpsman did not stop him. At 11:15, Woodson returned to the crossroads. More wounded had arrived. A squad ambushed in the hedgerows, 5 casualties. 1 dead, 4 wounded. Woodson began treating them. At 11:30, the German counterattack began. Artillery intensified. Shells fell continuously around the crossroads. Then German infantry emerged from the hedgerows, advancing in short rushes. 2 Panzer IV tanks followed them forward. Their 75mm guns fired high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. American forces answered with rifles, machine guns, bazookas. The crossroads became a battlefield, and Woodson stayed where he was, between the wounded and the fire, doing the only job he had come to Normandy to do. The fighting closed in. It became personal. Close range. Rifle fire cracked from hedgerow to hedgerow. Grenades burst in short, violent flashes. Men fell on both sides. American and German wounded lay mixed together in the fields between the earthen walls. Woodson kept working. He treated whoever reached him first. An American with a chest wound. A German with a shattered leg. Another American torn by shrapnel. Uniforms no longer mattered. Rank no longer mattered. Nationality did not matter. They were wounded. He was a medic. That was enough. By 12 o'clock, Woodson had been working 29 hours straight. 29 hours without sleep, without food, without treatment for his own wounds. His count stood at 183 wounded soldiers treated. His fever climbed past 104 degrees. His vision blurred at the edges. His left leg no longer functioned at all. Even with the rifle crutch, he could barely stand. Staff Sergeant Bell found him at the crossroads. Bell had been looking for him for nearly an hour. He saw the leg, swollen, infected, streaked red to the hip. He saw Woodson sway while standing. He saw the glassy eyes, the flushed skin, the tremor in his hands. Bell made the decision. He called for stretcher bearers. Woodson tried to refuse. Bell cut him off. "You're done," he said. "You did enough." The bearers lifted Woodson onto the stretcher. As they started toward the beach, Woodson looked back at the crossroads, at the wounded still waiting, at the fighting still raging. For the first time in 29 hours, Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. was no longer working. The evacuation began at 12:15. The carry took 45 minutes. Hedgerows, shell craters, burned equipment, bodies. The bearers navigated carefully, keeping the stretcher level. Woodson lay staring at the sky, low gray clouds, brief breaks of blue. Aircraft crossed overhead. American fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts patrolling uncontested airspace. The Luftwaffe never came. At 1300 hours, they reached Omaha Beach. It looked different now. More equipment ashore. Trucks, artillery, ammunition stacked in rows. Beach obstacles cleared. Supply dumps organized behind the seawall. They carried Woodson to an evacuation point near the waterline. About 50 wounded waited there, some on stretchers, others sitting in the sand. All were tagged with injuries and treatments. A Navy corpsman examined Woodson. Temperature, 104. 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Pulse, rapid, weak. Leg, severe infection. The corpsman marked his tag with a red cross. Priority evacuation. At 13:30, an LCVP approached the beach. It had just returned from a hospital ship. It could take wounded back. 20 men were selected. Woodson was among them. The stretcher bearers carried him into the surf, lifted him aboard. Sailors secured the stretchers across the deck. At 13:45, the LCVP pulled away from the beach. Waves rolled 3 to 4 feet. The craft pitched and slammed. Several wounded vomited. Woodson closed his eyes and rode it out. 30 minutes later, they reached USS Atronar. White hull. Red crosses painted large on the sides. A hospital ship. Cargo nets were lowered. Stretchers were hoisted one by one. Woodson rose 50 feet above the water, then disappeared inside the ship. The interior was white, clean, bright. Electric lights. Order. A Navy surgeon examined him at tree-off. Severe infection. Multiple shrapnel wounds. Extreme exhaustion. High fever. Woodson drifted as voices moved around him. For the first time since 6:30 on June 6th, the fighting was no longer his responsibility. Lieutenant Commander Robert Shaw examined the leg carefully. He pressed along the swollen tissue, checked the fever, inspected the shrapnel wounds. They were 24 hours old, contaminated with sand and seawater. Deep tissue infection was already present. The risk of sepsis was real. Shaw did not hesitate. Woodson needed immediate surgery, debridement of infected tissue, intravenous antibiotics, blood transfusions to replace what he had lost. Every hour mattered. Delay could mean the loss of the leg or the loss of the patient. At 14:45, Woodson was moved into an operating room. Nurses cut away his blood-soaked uniform. His body was washed clean of salt, sand, and dried blood. And formalin was started in his right arm. Saline flowed to combat dehydration. Blood was drawn for typing and cross-matching. An anesthetist placed an ether mask over his face. Woodson breathed deeply. "Count backward," the nurse said. 99, 98, 97. He never reached 94. At 1500 hours, Lieutenant Commander Shaw began surgery. He opened the left thigh with a long incision. The damage was extensive. Shrapnel had driven fragments of fabric, sand, and bacteria deep into the muscle. Infection had spread through multiple muscle groups. Shaw worked methodically. Dead tissue was cut away. Infected muscle was removed. The wound was flushed repeatedly with saline. One by one, he located the metal fragments and removed them with forceps. 7 pieces of shrapnel, each between 1 and 3 centimeters long. They were placed in a metal tray. Saved. The surgery lasted 2 hours. At 1700 hours, Shaw closed the wound, left drainage tubes in place, and applied pressure dressings. Woodson remained unconscious as he was moved to recovery. A bed, clean white sheets, a pillow, the first bed he had slept in since leaving England 5 days earlier. Nurses monitored his vitals, temperature, pulse, blood pressure, respiration, recording everything on the chart at the foot of the bed. At 1800 hours, Woodson woke. He was confused at first, disoriented. He did not remember the surgery, did not know where he was. A nurse explained. He was aboard USS Atranar. He had been evacuated from Omaha Beach. The surgery was finished. Woodson asked immediately about the wounded, about the crossroads, about the men he had left behind, about the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. The nurse had no answers. She told him to rest. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. His thoughts stayed on the beach. At 2000 hours, Lieutenant Commander Shaw returned. He checked the leg. The bandages were dry. No excessive bleeding. The infection would take time, but the surgery had worked. The leg was saved. Woodson would walk again. Shaw asked quietly how long Woodson had worked on the beach. How many casualties? Woodson answered simply. About 183. 29 hours. Shaw paused. He told Woodson he would recommend him for commendation. At 2100 hours, nurses brought food. Real food. Hot mashed potatoes. Gravy. Canned vegetables. Bread. Coffee. The first proper meal Woodson had eaten since June 5th. He ate slowly. His stomach could only manage half. Throughout the night, landing craft continued arriving from Omaha Beach. The wounded came steadily. Stretchers filled the corridors. Operating rooms ran without pause. By midnight, all 400 beds aboard Atranar were occupied. Some wounded were placed on deck. The ship worked through the night, quietly, relentlessly, just as Woodson had done on the beach. Multiple operating rooms worked at once. Steel doors opened and closed without pause. Stretchers moved through narrow corridors. Surgeons operated under harsh white lights while nurses passed instruments in silence. USS Atranar functioned as a floating city of wounds and urgency. At 2 o'clock on June 8th, Woodson woke. The fever that had burned through his body for 2 days was finally breaking. His temperature had dropped to 102 degrees Fahrenheit, still elevated, but no longer dangerous. The antibiotics were working. The infection was retreating. His left leg throbbed with deep, persistent pain, but the swelling had eased. The tight pressure beneath the skin was gone. He lay still, listening. Engines hummed below decks. Boots moved along passageways. Somewhere nearby, a man cried out in his sleep. Caught again on the beach, in the surf, under fire. Others moaned softly. Some whispered. Some were silent. Woodson understood. He had been there too. At 6 o'clock, nurses returned. Bandages were removed and replaced. Drains were checked. The incision was clean. The tissue beneath was pink and viable. Blood flow was strong. No signs of renewed infection. Lieutenant Commander Robert Shaw arrived soon after. He examined the leg carefully and nodded once. "You're healing well," he said. "You'll stay aboard Atranar a few more days. Then we'll move you to England." Woodson listened. Several weeks of recovery. Possible discharge from active duty. No return to combat. Woodson asked when he could rejoin his unit. Shaw looked at him in disbelief. Return to duty. After 29 hours of uninterrupted work while wounded. After treating 183 casualties. After nearly dying from infection. Recovery would take months, Shaw explained. The leg needed time. The body needed time. The war, for him, was over. Woodson did not argue, but he did not accept it either. His thoughts were still on Omaha Beach, on Staff Sergeant Bell, on Capers, on Worthy, on the other medics still working in shell holes and farmhouses, on the wounded still coming in, on work unfinished. As USS Atranar swayed gently 5 miles offshore, Woodson began planning how to convince the doctors to let him return. He remained aboard Atranar from June 8th through June 11th. Each day he improved. The fever disappeared completely. The infection cleared. Strength returned slowly. The incision healed cleanly, without complications. On June 12th, Woodson was transferred to a British hospital ship, HMS Amsterdam. The vessel departed Normandy waters at 8 o'clock, carrying 480 wounded American soldiers. The crossing took 6 hours. At 1400 hours, they reached Southampton. Ambulances waited at the docks. Woodson was transported to the 132nd General Hospital in Wiltshire, a sprawling facility with 3,000 beds, staffed entirely by American medical personnel. He was placed in a ward with 30 other recovering soldiers. Most were D-Day casualties. Some from Omaha, some from Utah, some airborne troops from inland. Different units. Same memories. Doctors examined him daily. Bandages were changed. Progress was steady. The infection was gone. Muscle tissue was regenerating. Scarring would remain, but function would return. Physical therapy began on June 15th. 10 feet. 20 feet. Crutches under his arms. The leg was weak. Muscles had wasted during infection. Each step hurt. Each step mattered. By June 20th, Woodson could walk 100 feet without crutches, limping, in pain, but upright. He asked again about returning to duty. The answer did not change. Minimum 6 weeks. Possibly longer. No combat return. During recovery, Woodson learned what had happened to the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. They stayed on Omaha Beach for 5 months. Deployed balloons over supply depots. Over command posts. Moved inland as the front advanced. 3 men from the battalion were killed on D-Day. Private Edward Thowley. Private Albert Cole. Private Willie Hines. 17 more were wounded. Woodson had treated 12 of them. The battalion received a commendation from General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Woodson said nothing when he heard. He simply lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling, knowing that whatever orders said, whatever history recorded, he had done his duty where it mattered most. General Dwight D. Eisenhower praised the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion publicly. He said the unit had carried out its mission with courage and determination under the most extreme conditions. He stated that the battalion proved itself an essential element of the Allied air defense effort during the invasion. The commendation was official. It was entered into the battalion's record as formal recognition of its service on D-Day. During his recovery, Woodson also learned the full cost of June 6th. The official casualty figures were staggering. Approximately 10,000 American casualties in a single day. Nearly 2,000 killed. More than 8,000 wounded. Omaha Beach alone accounted for over 4,000 casualties, nearly half of all American losses on D-Day. No other single day in United States military history had produced such numbers. On June 25th, Captain John Schwab visited Woodson at the hospital. Schwab commanded Battery A, 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. He had spent D-Day coordinating balloon deployments on Omaha Beach, while Woodson treated wounded in the surf and on the sand. Schwab brought news. Woodson had been recommended for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation detailed everything. 29 hours of continuous medical service. 183 wounded treated. 3 soldiers rescued from drowning under fire. Emergency amputations performed without surgical equipment. Continued service despite severe wounds and life-threatening infection. Schwab told him the recommendation had strong backing. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, commander of all logistics and support forces in the European theater, had personally reviewed it and endorsed it. Lee believed Woodson's actions met the highest standard of valor. The paperwork had been forwarded to higher headquarters. Woodson was surprised. He had not expected recognition. He believed he had simply done his duty. Medics treated the wounded. That was the job. Schwab disagreed. What Woodson had done, Schwab said, went far beyond duty. It was extraordinary courage and endurance under fire. On July 1st, Woodson received the Bronze Star. The ceremony took place at the hospital. Colonel Thomas Davis conducted the presentation. He read the citation aloud, describing Woodson's actions on Omaha Beach, his treatment of wounded soldiers under constant fire, his rescue of drowning men, his refusal to stop working despite serious wounds. The Bronze Star was a significant award, one of the highest decorations for valor. But it was not the Medal of Honor. Woodson asked what had happened to the higher recommendation. Schwab told him it was still under review. These things take time, he said. Be patient. By mid-July, Woodson was walking normally again. The limp was barely noticeable. Pain remained, but it was manageable. Strength had returned to his left leg. Doctors cleared him for light duty. He was assigned to the hospital staff, where he assisted in treating recovering soldiers and helped with physical therapy. His medical training and combat experience made him valuable. In August, Woodson was promoted to sergeant. The promotion came with an extra $21 per month, but more importantly, it brought responsibility. He supervised other medics and helped train new medical personnel arriving from the United States. On August 15th, Stars and Stripes published an article about him. The paper called Woodson a hero. It praised him and other medics of the 320th for their actions on D-Day, saying they had covered themselves with glory. The story spread quickly across the European theater. Black newspapers in the United States picked it up as well. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American. They called Woodson the #1 invasion hero. They emphasized his courage and noted that he served with the only African-American combat unit to land at Omaha Beach. The attention became national. In September, letters began arriving from home. From his mother, from his father, from friends and neighbors who had read his story. Woodson read them quietly, one by one. He was proud of his unit, proud of the men he had served beside, proud of the lives he had helped save. But he still wondered what had happened to the recommendation that had been sent up the chain, the one meant to recognize what he had done on the bloodiest beach of the war. Everyone back home was proud. In Philadelphia, word spread quickly. Community leaders began planning a public celebration for when Woodson returned. Newspapers called him a hero of D-Day. Churches spoke his name from pulpits. Families who had lost sons on Omaha Beach wrote letters thanking him for saving lives. But one thing remained unresolved: the Medal of Honor. Woodson asked Captain Schwab about it again. Schwab told him the same thing he'd said before. The recommendation was still under review. The process was slow, bureaucratic. Decisions took time. Be patient. Then, on October 1st, the answer finally came. The recommendation had been downgraded, not the Medal of Honor. Instead, Woodson would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award for valor. Still prestigious, still rare, but not the Medal of Honor. No explanation was provided. The decision came from higher headquarters. It was final. There was no appeal process. Schwab was furious. He believed the downgrade was indefensible. Woodson's actions met every requirement for the Medal of Honor. Extraordinary heroism. Repeated risk of life beyond the call of duty. Multiple eyewitnesses. Extensive medical documentation. Nothing was missing. Other officers agreed. Lieutenant Commander Robert Shaw, the Navy surgeon who operated on Woodson aboard the hospital ship, wrote a formal letter in support of the Medal of Honor. He described Woodson's condition on arrival: severe infection, massive tissue damage, high fever, near sepsis. No man, Shaw wrote, could perform continuous medical service for 29 hours in that condition without extraordinary courage. Navy corpsmen submitted statements. Staff Sergeant Alfred Bell wrote one. Private First Class Warren Capers wrote another. Corporal Eugene Worthy added his account. All described the same thing: a wounded medic who refused to stop, who saved lives while bleeding, crawling, and burning with fever. All supported the Medal of Honor recommendation. All were ignored. In November 1944, Woodson received the Distinguished Service Cross in a hospital ceremony. General John C. H. Lee personally presented the medal. He read the citation aloud. He praised Woodson's courage. He shook his hand and said the nation was proud of him. Woodson stood at attention, and as the medal was pinned to his uniform, he noticed something that could not be ignored. Of the more than 400 medals of honor awarded during World War II, not a single one had gone to an African-American service member. Not one. Despite more than 1 million Black Americans serving in uniform. Despite documented acts of heroism equal to, or greater than, those of white recipients. Despite eyewitness testimony, official reports, and undeniable evidence. The pattern was unmistakable. The system was broken. And on November 18, 1944, as Sergeant Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. stood there receiving a medal that should have been higher, he understood something clearly. The color of his skin had cost him the Medal of Honor. Woodson remained in England through December 1944. He continued working at the 132nd General Hospital, treating recovering soldiers, supervising medics, and training new medical personnel. His left leg healed completely. The limp faded. He was physically capable of returning to combat. He requested reassignment to the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. The request was denied. Army policy prohibited returning soldiers who had suffered serious wounds requiring major surgery to frontline combat. His medical record made the decision automatic. Woodson would remain on hospital duty. In January 1945, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion left France. The unit returned to the United States for rest and retraining, with plans for eventual deployment to the Pacific. The war against Japan was expected to last years. Barrage balloons would be needed again. The battalion arrived at Camp Stewart, Georgia, in February. Woodson was not with them. He remained in England. Then, in March 1945, new orders arrived. Medical discharge. His military service was ending. On March 28, 1945, Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. boarded a transport ship at Southampton, bound for New York. The war in Europe was entering its final weeks, but for him, it was already over. The Atlantic crossing took 8 days. On April 5th, the ship passed the Statue of Liberty and docked in New York Harbor. Woodson was processed through a separation center, issued his final paperwork, and on April 8, 1945, he was officially discharged from the United States Army. 1 month later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended on May 8. The war in the Pacific would continue until August, until Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan to capitulate. But Woodson was already a civilian, back in Philadelphia, trying to rebuild a life that no longer fit the person he had become. Adjustment was difficult. Sleep brought nightmares. Omaha Beach replayed endlessly. Men screaming, blood in the surf, bodies drifting in the waves, the smell of cordite and burned flesh. The memories were sharp, intrusive, and unrelenting. Tom did not dull them. In 1947, Woodson married Joan Catherine. They had known each other before the war. She had waited for him. Together they built a quiet life. They raised children. He worked as a medical technician, using the skills he had learned under fire. He was calm under pressure, efficient, trusted, but he never spoke about D-Day. Not to his children, not to coworkers, not even to close friends. They knew he had served. They knew he had been wounded. They knew he wore medals on formal occasions. But the details, the 30 hours, the rescues, the amputations, the crawling through sand while bleeding, those stayed locked inside him. As the years passed, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion faded from public memory. History books focused on infantry divisions, airborne units, armored breakthroughs. Barrage balloon units were footnotes, if mentioned at all. That the 320th was African American made them even easier to forget. The 1950s and 1960s brought the civil rights movement. Black veterans fought again, this time for recognition, equality, and dignity at home. Some injustices were addressed. Many were not. Woodson watched quietly from Philadelphia. He worked. He raised his family. He did not seek attention. In 1994, during the 50th anniversary of D-Day, a journalist interviewed him. Woodson was 70 years old. For the first time publicly, he told the story. The landing craft explosion. The wounded. The drowning soldiers. The 30 hours without rest. The reporter was stunned. He asked why Woodson had never received the Medal of Honor. Woodson replied simply that the recommendation had been downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross. When asked why, Woodson did not answer directly. He didn't have to. The implication was clear. The article ran in several newspapers. It caused little reaction. 50 years had passed. The country had moved on. The story disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Then, in 2001, Congress passed the Code Talkers Recognition Act, awarding long overdue recognition to Native American code talkers from both world wars. The legislation raised an uncomfortable question. Who else had been overlooked? Attention turned to African American veterans, Hispanic veterans, Asian American veterans, units whose service had been minimized, ignored, or erased. In 2005, Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. died at age 83, at home in Philadelphia. His wife Joan was with him. So were his children. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His medals were displayed at the funeral. Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. One medal was missing, the Medal of Honor. That absence lingered. It troubled his family. It troubled historians. It troubled those who eventually learned what he had done. The question refused to go away. Why had Waverly Woodson been denied the nation's highest award for valor? In 2015, journalist Linda Herview published Forgotten, the untold story of D-Day's Black heroes, at home and at war. The book documented the service of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion and examined how race shaped recognition after the war. Woodson's story was central. Her view uncovered witness statements, medical reports, official recommendations. She found evidence that General John C. H. Lee's office had supported upgrading Woodson's award to the Medal of Honor, and that the recommendation had vanished inside the bureaucracy. Historians reviewed the record. Every requirement was met. Every standard satisfied. The evidence was overwhelming. And for the first time in decades, the nation was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. had earned the Medal of Honor. The only question left was whether America would finally admit it. The downgrade of Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr.'s award never made sense. To historians, fellow soldiers, and his family, it appeared unjust and increasingly impossible to separate from the racial discrimination that shaped the U.S. military during World War II. In 2018, the case reached Capitol Hill. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland began formally advocating for Woodson. Van Hollen wrote directly to the Secretary of the Army, requesting a full review of Woodson's record. He argued that Woodson had clearly met and exceeded the criteria for the Medal of Honor, and that the original denial represented a historical wrong that demanded correction. The Army's response was cautious and procedural. Officials acknowledged that Woodson's actions were extraordinary and that the historical record was compelling. But they cited a regulation. Medal of Honor recommendations must be submitted within 3 years of the action. Woodson's recommendation had originated in 1944. More than 7 decades had passed. Too late, they said. Van Hollen rejected that reasoning. He argued that timelines should not shield injustice, especially when discrimination had played a role in denying recognition in the first place. A wrong uncorrected for decades, he said, should not become permanent simply because time passed. The Army disagreed. Rules were rules. No exceptions. In 2020, Congress introduced bipartisan legislation to award Woodson the Medal of Honor. Democrats and Republicans alike supported the bill. The evidence was overwhelming. The moral case was clear. The bill advanced through committee. Then the COVID-19 pandemic halted much of congressional business. The legislation never reached a vote. When the session ended, the bill expired. Van Hollen promised to reintroduce it. Progress remained slow. Meanwhile, Joanne Woodson continued her fight. By 2024, she was 95 years old. For 19 years, since her husband's death in 2005, she had written letters, attended meetings, testified before committees, and told Waverly's story to anyone willing to listen. She was not asking for praise, only fairness. In May 2024, the Army made an announcement. Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. would be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The announcement confused many. Woodson had already received the Distinguished Service Cross in 1944, or so everyone believed. The explanation was bureaucratic and unsettling. The Army had lost the original documentation. No official record of the 1944 presentation existed. On paper, Woodson had never received the medal at all. The Army said it was correcting the record. For advocates and historians, this explanation only reinforced how Woodson's service had been mishandled for decades. A ceremony was scheduled for June 7, 2024, the 80th anniversary of Woodson's evacuation from Omaha Beach. It would take place at the Pentagon. Joanne would receive the medal on her husband's behalf. The Distinguished Service Cross was meaningful, but it was not enough. The family made that clear. The fight for the Medal of Honor would continue. On June 7, 2024, U.S. Army soldiers from 1st Army conducted a separate ceremony on Omaha Beach, at the exact stretch of sand where Woodson had come ashore on June 6, 1944. 80 years later, the Distinguished Service Cross was placed gently on the sand. Major General William Ryan led the ceremony. He spoke plainly. Woodson had saved lives here. He had worked for nearly 30 hours while wounded. He had treated hundreds of casualties. The recognition had come far too late. The soldiers stood in silence. The beach was peaceful now. Tourists walked the shoreline. Children played in the surf. The air carried no gunfire, no explosions, only wind, water, and memory. Among those present was Staff Sergeant Aaron Williams, an African-American soldier serving in today's Army. He spoke afterward, saying that standing on the exact ground where Woodson fought was deeply moving. Woodson's story mattered, he said, not just to history, but to those serving now. The medal was then carefully packaged and sent back to the United States. On September 24, 2024, at the Pentagon, the final ceremony took place. Joanne Woodson sat in the front row, surrounded by her family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. 3 generations gathered to witness recognition long denied. Secretary of the Army Christine Wormuth presented the Distinguished Service Cross and read the citation aloud. It detailed Woodson's actions on Omaha Beach, treating casualties under fire, rescuing drowning soldiers, working through infection and fever, refusing to stop. The citation listed the number plainly. Nearly 200 wounded soldiers treated. It was official recognition at last. But the family's position remained unchanged. Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. had earned the Medal of Honor. And until that injustice was corrected, the story would not end. The citation listed everything. It named the rescues, 3 soldiers pulled from the surf, saved from drowning under direct enemy fire. It detailed the medical procedures, emergency amputations, treatment of sucking chest wounds, fracture stabilization, plasma transfusions, shock management, performed with minimal supplies, no shelter, and no rest. It recorded that all of it happened while Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. was himself seriously wounded, running a high fever, and exposed to artillery and machine gun fire for nearly 30 continuous hours. When Joanne Woodson accepted the medal, she held it carefully in both hands. She studied the ribbon, the bronze cross, the engraved inscription. Her hands trembled. Tears ran down her face. Behind her, family members stood. Then the room stood with them. The applause lasted 2 full minutes. Not polite applause, sustained applause, for a man overlooked for 80 years. Senator Chris Van Hollen spoke next. He said Woodson was a hero who saved dozens, possibly hundreds, of American lives. He said the only thing that had ever stood between Woodson and proper recognition was the color of his skin. He called the moment an opportunity to confront a historic wrong. And he made it clear, the fight for the Medal of Honor was not over. Then Steve Woodson, Waverly's son, took the podium. He was 66 years old. His voice shook as he spoke. He said it had been a long road to reach this day. He said his father would have been humbled by the recognition. He said the medal mattered, not just to their family, but to the truth. And then he said what everyone in the room understood, but few were willing to state outright. The Distinguished Service Cross was not the Medal of Honor. That fact remained. So did the injustice. The question refused to fade. Why was Waverly Woodson denied the nation's highest award for valor? The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of witness statements from soldiers who survived because of him. Medical reports documenting his wounds and advanced infection. Service records confirming 29 hours of continuous service. Lists showing nearly 200 casualties treated. Verified rescues from the surf. Life-saving procedures performed while under constant enemy fire. The criteria for the Medal of Honor were explicit. Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Woodson met that standard repeatedly. Yet he received the second highest decoration, not the highest. The pattern was undeniable. During World War II, 433 Medals of Honor were awarded. 0 went to African American soldiers. None. Not one. Despite more than 1 million Black Americans serving in uniform. Despite documented acts of valor equal to, or exceeding, those of white recipients. In 1997, the Army commissioned a formal study to examine whether African American troops had been unjustly overlooked. The study confirmed systemic discrimination and recommended 7 African American soldiers for retroactive Medal of Honor upgrades. President Bill Clinton personally presented the medals at the White House. Waverly Woodson was considered during that study. He was interviewed. He provided documentation. He described his actions in detail. He was not selected. No explanation was given. The decision was final. The timeline argument remained a shield. Medal of Honor recommendations had to be acted on within 3 years. Woodson's recommendation had been submitted in 1944, but downgraded, not rejected. Advocates argued that downgrade should have allowed reconsideration. The Army disagreed. Too late. Rules were rules. Those who knew the story rejected that logic. Rules, they argued, should not protect injustice. They should not preserve discrimination. They should not deny recognition earned through extraordinary courage. And so the story did not end with applause at the Pentagon. It ended with a question still unanswered, and a fight that was not finished. The fight did not end with applause at the Pentagon. In 2024, momentum returned. Multiple national organizations publicly supported Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. for the Medal of Honor. The NAACP, Veterans of Foreign Wars, American Legion, and the Congressional Black Caucus all agreed on one point. Woodson met every standard for the nation's highest award for valor. His case was not ambiguous. It was overwhelming. New legislation was drafted to correct what history had failed to do. The bill would award Woodson the Medal of Honor by act of Congress, bypassing the outdated timeline restrictions that had long shielded injustice behind procedure. The legislation had bipartisan sponsors, support in both chambers, and endorsements from veterans organizations across the country. On paper, it looked unstoppable. But as late 2024 arrived, the bill still had not been brought to a vote. Still in committee, still under review, still delayed. And Joanne Woodson was 95 years old. Time, the same argument once used to deny justice, was now the enemy again. Recognition needed to come soon, or it would arrive too late to matter to the woman who had spent nearly 2 decades fighting for her husband's legacy. Woodson's impact, however, was already shaping the future. Modern military medical training studies his actions on Omaha Beach as a case study in extreme combat medicine. His decisions, triage under fire, resource management with depleted supplies, sustained operations despite personal injury, are taught at combat medic schools today. His methods are not theoretical. They are doctrine. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, long ignored by history, has also begun receiving overdue recognition. In 2003, a memorial plaque was installed at the American Cemetery in Normandy, acknowledging the battalion as the first African-American combat unit to land on Omaha Beach. In 2019, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture opened an exhibit featuring the 320th photographs, equipment, personal accounts. Woodson's story stands at its center. Visitors learn what textbooks once omitted. But plaques are not enough. Exhibits are not enough. Acknowledgement without justice is not enough. The facts remain unchanged. On June 6 and 7, 1944, Corporal Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. performed acts of extraordinary valor on Omaha Beach. He worked 30 hours without rest, while seriously wounded, treated approximately 200 casualties, rescued 3 soldiers from drowning, performed battlefield surgery with minimal equipment, and risked his life repeatedly under constant enemy fire. He met every requirement for the Medal of Honor. He was denied, not for lack of courage, not for lack of evidence, but because of the color of his skin. That injustice remains, 80 years later. The wrong has not yet been fully corrected. And until Waverly Woodson receives the Medal of Honor he earned on the bloodiest beach in American military history, the story is not finished.